Good morning. Take a seat. Come on, get in. There is room for everyone. Okay, today we're looking at something cool, something interesting, albeit ultimately useless, which is how much are people dying in the raid? And more importantly, which of the specs are dying the most? Who is failing and who is causing your raid to wipe? Before that, though, we have to take a tiny look at the current situation in the raid, because yes, when it comes to the damage in Heroic, it is still mostly the same. We have already went through this a few days ago. It doesn't really change much. By this point, we have enough logs. We have gotten, to the 50, 60, 70,000 logs to have these results be, somewhat consistent. Assassination Rogue, Demonology Warlock, Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman. It's been a few days since the last time, but the numbers and general performance hasn't really changed. What I wanted to look at instead of this is Mythic. So it's just been a few days in Mythic, and then now it's Friday and Saturday. Not many guilds are going to be raiding, so it's not going to be much more data coming in. And also for 99% of people who got into Mythic, they basically got to fight the first Taragru, Eye of the Jailer. Some have gone for the 9, and that's it. At the moment of this video, there is like 15 guilds who have even killed the 4th boss, so it's very, very early. But I wanted to look at just one thing that is pretty enlightening so far. Looking at the damage in Mythic, which is of course pointless. There is only, 300 or 400 logs for each spec and whatnot. There is one thing that catches the eye if I show you this graph. Now, which is it? What is immediately apparent when you look at this? What is clear? What is clear is this. When you look at the specs at the top, even with the low amount of logs, even with the low amount of data, which makes this unreliable, we see that we have Assassination, Arms, Feral, Ret, Frost Decay, Frost Mage, Subtlety, Havoc, Windwalker, and Fury. So, I'm not an expert in specs, but this tells me that in the first 10 specs, currently, in the first couple of days, 3 days or so of Mythic raiding, 9 of them, 9 out of 10 are melee. And what also tells me another thing is that the only non-melee spec in there, in that bunch, is Frost Mage. Which is also interesting because Frost Mage is a very mobile spec. Nearly 70%, even more, of the casts of a Frost Mage are going to be instant. Between Ice Lance, Flurry, and Frostbolt, the real chunk of damage they will spend casting is just Frostbolt. So it makes them quite mobile, so they don't suffer, they don't get penalized as much as the rest of the casters, so they make it up there. But for the rest, it's just a melee fiesta so far. That's the only thing that was worth mentioning about the first few days of Mythic. We will eventually go back once we have gotten more numbers, once we have gotten more boss kills, because many things might change based on the type of boss, the type of damage required of the boss. If it's single target, if it's AoE, there is going to be big swings in terms of performance for many of the specs. So for now, there wasn't really much of a reason to go over the damage or the statistics for the raid, except for this one, except for pointing out that at the moment, when it comes to Mythic, it seems to be very, very prominent, the performance of melee specs. Whereas in Heroic, it was already there, because going back to Heroic, we saw Demonology and Shadow Priest and Elemental Shaman at the top, so that's casters, right? That's doing fine. But around them at the top, you have Assassination, Subtlety, Feral, Arms, Havoc, Retribution, again. So those 3 range specs have made it to the top, but the rest of the casters were still performing not as well and not as highly as we have seen them in the last, I guess, few tiers. Both Castle Nathria and even the ones from BFA. So it was already somewhat visible in Heroic, this type of switch, to the point that we, and when I say we, I mean me, asked ourselves, and when I say ourselves, I mean myself, is there going to be a melee uprising? Because it looks like melee are performing much better compared to before because of all this heavy movement, penalizing the casters. So it was interesting to point out the current situation in Mythic, given the very stark disparity so far of specs performing in Mythic raiding. Now, it's time to go on to the meme. The meme of the moment is going to be how much have specs died? How much do they die in the raid? Who is causing which wipes? Now, Just for fun, because we have made this video before when it comes to Castle Nathria specs and how much they died, we're going to have a comparison so far. How many of the specs have died right now in Sanctum of Domination compared to Castle Nathria, if there has been a change in that sense. Now, using Castle Nathria Mythic, which is of course a little bit harder than the current version of Heroic of Sanctum of Domination, however, this is the start of the tier, so many people are gonna find it harder than average. Back then, the most dying specs during wipes, which means before a wipe was called, which means after a certain amount of players have died, something like 4 or 5 players, and the boss doesn't die, it's a wipe, and all of the other players dying after those few ones are not counted as dying, just like when you call a wipe. When you call a wipe and everyone else dies, those are not meaningful deaths. And it's worth explaining, otherwise you would be wondering, wait, how do specs only have a 40% death rate during a wipe? Don't you just all die during a wipe? Yeah, but the only deaths that count are the first ones, right? Are the ones that cause the wipe. In Castle Nathria, the most dying specs were Discipline Priest, Arcane Mage, Marksmanship Hunter, and Frost Mage. Now, this is interesting, because right now, in Heroic, the most dying specs when it comes to wipes. Not when it comes to kills, so not when the attempt is successful, only when you're making mistakes and people mess up and die and cause the wipe. The specs dying the most are Marksmanship, Discipline, Arms, Frost, Balance, and Arcane. So, this is essentially almost the same as Castle Nathria. The only outlier is that Frost Decay is not dying as much, and Balance Druid is dying slightly more, but for the rest, all of the other specs are still there. When you go at the bottom, and this is very likely and very often going to be the same, is the tanks, with Protection Paladin being the tank that dies the most out of all the other tanks. This is generally going to be pretty consistent with the tanks dying less. You also have some other similarities, like Demonology Warlock being pretty tanky and dying very rarely, as well as Outlaw Rogue dying rarely together with other specs like Havoc and the remaining rogue specs. There are some similarities with a few exceptions here and there, but it has kept up mostly the same. What about, instead, the kills? So the actual successful attempts. Who is still dying despite the kill? Now, in Castle Nathria, even when you were killing the boss, you had roughly a 1 in 3 chance that the entirety of your hunter roster was going to die, regardless, as well as Arcane Mage at the top. Arms Warrior was still there, together with Frost Mage as well, and Balance. So the specs dying more often in wipes are still there during the kills. And once again, when you look at the least dying specs, and this time of course the percentages are much lower than wipes, because if you're killing the boss, generally speaking, most of your raid is going to stay alive, so tanks are going to have a very low death rate, nearing 10%. You still have the more resilient specs, like the rogue ones being at the bottom. You have shamans as well being at the bottom, also because they can pseudo-cheat by using Ankh. Ankh is not counted as a death because it's part of your toolkit, it's your own combat res. When we look at right now instead, when you look at Sanctum of Domination, there is a change, because there is not just all of the hunter specs all at the top. Marksmanship is still there. Marksmanship doesn't want to be outdone, wants to continue dying on all the kills regardless, together with Arms, which is also pretty high, as well as Frost and Arcane Mage, still pretty high. Similarly to Castle Nathria though, all of the rogue specs are at the bottom, together with the shaman specs as well. The more interesting part, I would say, of these changes is that when we're looking at Castle Nathria, we're also looking at the fact that in Castle Nathria it was Fire Mage that was being played, not something like Arcane Mage or Frost Mage, for example. So even though technically all of the, good or top elite players were playing Fire in Castle Nathria, and now they have gone playing Frost and Arcane, you would think that the deaths would also change. Now that there are better players playing Frost and Arcane, their deaths should be lower compared to Fire. And conversely, now that Fire has much less good players, quality players, because they all moved away, Fire deaths should go higher. Not really, actually. The numbers have remained about the same. It's Arcane and Frost Mages that die, and it's Fire Mage that dies less. Of course, Fire Mage has, similar to the Shamans with Ankh, Fire Mage as a cheat death. right? So they have cauterized. They can get saved in that way and not count as a death, as opposed to the Frost and the Arcane Mage, which don't have that tool. So unfortunately, it looks like the stereotype of marksmanship hunters, or hunters in general, huntards, continues to live even in this new tier. Hunters continue to die more often than other specs in general. The surprising one is arms. Arms has been pretty high in deaths so far. The other thing worth mentioning is that at the top we have gotten, except for arms, we have gotten many of the casters. From Frost to Arcane to Balance to Shadow Priest, and of course Marksmanship, which isn't a caster but it's a ranged. Whereas many of the melee specs are towards the bottom. You have all of the rogue specs, you have Havoc, you have Feral, Enhancement, you have Retribution Paladin, you have Feral, you have Enhancement, which are towards the bottom half. So not only do we have better performing melee DPS specs, when it comes to damage, you also have them dying less than casters. So this is the place where you come to give explanations, okay? Marksmanship players, arms players, Frost Mage and Arcane Mage players, and even Balanced Druid players, you have to explain yourself. What are you doing to die 1 in every 3 kills? Why do you have a 35% chance to die in every single boss? What are you fucking up right now? And congratulations to the players on the specs dying roughly 1 every 6 or 7 bosses. Finally, all 3 rogue specs, congratulations, are at the bottom. Back in Castle Nathria, I complained about them when I was looking at the death rates, because I mentioned that a rogue should always be the last one to die. You have cheat death, you have evasion, you have Cloak of Shadows, and you have feint. You even have a self-heal, so you have no explanations for dying as a rogue, basically ever, before the wipe is called. So, at the very least now, they are much more resilient. They are doing much better in terms of deaths compared to before. We also have the continuation that we have seen the last time when it comes to priests. Discipline still dies a lot more than Holy Priest. Discipline is kind of has a minor excuse because they can be much more immobile, especially when they have to do their whole rotation centered around Spirit Shell. They are sort of rooted in place until they finish that, which is, as I said, a pseudo explanation. It doesn't explain where they die 50% or 60% more than a Holy Paladin or a Shaman, for example. So you still owe your people an explanation. Now, lastly, when you look at the deaths, we can look at Mythic, okay? We have looked at Heroic because many people have gotten in Heroic, and also because many people were trying Heroic for the first time, so of course many logs are going to be Heroic right now instead of Mythic, and also because when it comes to the first week or the first couple of weeks of Heroic, that's still very, highly tuned. I'm not saying it's harder than, Mythic bosses in Castle Nathria, but for example, you could say that Painsmith Raznal in Heroic this week or last week was harder than, say, Mythic Inerva, for example. Is there anyone who would contest that? Not really. So when we look at Mythic, the amount of bosses available, of course, to be dying on are much lower. Basically, it's just 3 of them. The first 3, Taragru, Eye of the Jailer, and the 9. Is there any change? Do we have any sort of switcheroos? No. Looking at both the kills and the wipes combined, is there any difference? Not really. At the top, we still have Discipline and Arcane and Marksmanship, as well as Arms, as well as Frost. Frost DK also gets up there. Again, they're kind of dying way more often than Unholy, something we haven't mentioned before. Balanced Druid is also showing up again. And then at the bottom, you still have the tanks. At the bottom, you still have the rogues. You have Restoration Shaman. You have Havoc, as well as Demonology and Destruction. Destruction is particularly important because it's also doing very well in damage. So unlike something like Arcane or Frost or Balance, or even Shadow Priest, which is also doing very well, Destruction is maintaining good performance while also dying quite little as a Warlock spec. So this was the cool tidbit to look into for today, the deaths, which of course are going to keep expanding as the days and the weeks go by. We will go and take a look again as we get more and more boss kills and more people get to do more and more bosses in Mythic, and as well as, Heroic becomes more and more trivial, so the numbers and the data from Heroic keeps losing more and more value, whereas Mythic becomes the more important one. As we close the video, we have to point out something, which is the takeover that's happening for a few specs. Much to my surprise, because in the PTR this wasn't happening, but you can get 48 Renown this week. It wasn't planned, or at least Blizzard forgot to specify this, because back in the PTR weeks ago, this week was Renown 47, not Renown 48. This is relevant because Renown 48 is the number you need, 48, the number you need for your Covenant-specific legendary, which means this. It means that some of the specs that have been waiting for this are able to now get it. Of course, many of them haven't made it in time to get it by Wednesday or even Thursday before the raids, so they went raiding with their old one. There is also the fact that they have to respec to a different Covenant, so maybe they weren't ready. But we already start to see some of the changes. You have rogues. Assassination has started picking up obedience, even though, of course, Doomblade is still much more popular. You have subtlety, which has also started to take obedience much quicker compared to assassination, and it's almost about to overtake finality. Then you have Fury Warrior, which has started picking up Sinful Surge after they have moved back to Venthyr. And finally, and likely the more important one, purely given by the representation. If we go back and look at the parses, Balanced Druid is still the most popular spec in the raid. Both Heroic and Mythic, Balance is the more represented. So this change is also the more important one. You have Balanced Druids with Sinful Hysteria, which has already overtaken all of the other legendaries at this point, this early in the week. It's already Venthyr Balanced Druid using Sinful Hysteria. Of course, many of the logs, many of the numbers we have been seeing so far are still done with the previous setup. They are still done with maybe being Night Fae or maybe using Primordial Arcanic Pulsar as a legendary. So we have to wait a few more raid nights, a few more resets, so that much of the data, the majority of the data for all of these specs is going to be using what they're going to be using very likely for the rest of the tier. These new legendaries in these new covenants. Which was also the point we made towards the start, when we started looking at Heroic, why Fury Warrior was performing worse than expected and why Balanced Druid was performing worse than expected, because they didn't have these legendaries. So now they have them. So now we will start seeing the actual performance with what they would have for the rest of the tier. And now, after this, we can stop. It's time to take a break, everyone. It's Friday, it's the weekend, go do whatever you want to do. However, before that, thank you for watching the video. If you want to support me, my channel, or my cat, you should support by subscribing to your local church newspaper. Always very interesting gossip in there, by the way. See you guys soon, and in the meantime... Friday, gonna get out on Friday.